Standing behind me is a North American B-25J Mitchell. This one's called Betty's Dream, and she flies like a bat out of hell. The B-25 was one of the most iconic planes of World War II and certainly played a vital role in the Allied front. It was designed by the US as a medium-sized bomber, but actually somewhere in the middle of the war transitioned more to our gunship, especially on the Pacific side of the fighting. For starters, let me hit you with some facts. The B-25 was first flown in 1940 and there were over 9,800 of them built, making it the most produced American medium-sized bomber. It was actually flown by the US Army Air Force and the United States Marine Corps, as well as the Royal Air Force, the Soviet Air Force, and many other Allied countries. Some other fun facts on the B-25 is that it has two Wright R2600 twin Cyclone engines. Man, that's a mouthful. They each produce up to 1,700 horsepower, have 14 cylinders, and are air-cooled. Each one of these radial engines also had a two-stage supercharger for increased altitude performance. Each B-25 was capable of carrying up to 180 gallons of fuel in the main tank, as well as separate 150-gallon tanks in each of the wings. And if that's not enough, additional fuel tanks could be installed for long-range missions. Moving around the side of the B-25, you see one of the huge radial engines here with the massive propeller, which happens to be very close to the pilot and the co-pilot. We'll talk about that in a little bit and what kind of effects that had. You see the gunner's turret up top there, along with the huge landing gear and tires and wheels. You notice we've got a gunner station on the starboard side, halfway through the fuselage, moving back to the tail, and there's also a place for a rear gunner as well. So as you can see, there are many 50 caliber machine guns all around this airplane. You got two on the back here, one on the back left side as well on the back right side. Moving up to the front of the aircraft, this one has 2, 4, 6, 8 machine guns. In fact, there were some J models that had a bunch more on the sides here, but it didn't start off this way. It started off as a medium-sized bomber. So there was just one gun on the front and they had smaller bomb bay doors. So this really converted from a medium-sized bomber to a full-on gunship, especially in the Pacific theater. Now the B-25G and H also introduced a 75mm cannon, which was the same size used in Sherman tanks. Although it was powerful, it had really slow reloading speed, and therefore the effectiveness was not as much as you would have thought it would have been, so they ultimately phased it out, focusing more on machine gun modifications. One of the very unique talking points of the B-25 is what's called the Gull Wing. Now, if you notice from looking at this from this angle, you can see the wing coming out of the fuselage going up ever so slightly and then going out flat. Now, the initial design of the B-25 was what's called a full span dihedral wing. That's complex speak for the wing started off low here, just like an airliner would, and then kind of came out from a gradual slope. Now, for the first 9 B-25s, they actually had this dihedral wing going on from the fuselage going out, but they stopped the production, reworked through their processes, and decided on this Gull Wing design, which in fact made the airplane a little bit more unstable in a good way. So the original design was in fact too stable. So by going for this Gull Wing design, it actually provided just enough instability from the cockpit side of things that the pilots in turn really loved it as a great flyer and great nimble aircraft. So the B-25 is actually called the Mitchell in honor of Brigadier General Billy Mitchell, who was court-martialed in 1925 for publicly criticizing the US government for not enabling more military aviation practices. He was a huge proponent of modernizing and weaponizing airplanes to serve in the US military, and in fact, he was court-martialed for his beliefs. So as a way to pay homage to this general and his vision, they actually named the Mitchell in his honor. And in fact, he's known today as the father of the US Air Force that came about 25 years later. Now, you can't do a B-25 Mitchell review without talking about the Doolittle Raid. So on April 18th, 1942, a few months after Pearl Harbor, Colonel Doolittle and 16 B-25s launched off the USS Hornet in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, about 600 some miles from Japan. They needed to be 400 some miles away, but there was a small Japanese boat that spotted them, so they launched early. It's a very famous mission. I'm sure you've heard all about it. For the first time ever, mind you, a US Army medium-sized bomber taking off for an American naval aircraft carrier for a one-way flight mission over Tokyo to bomb Tokyo to really strike at the heart of the empire as a way of payback for Pearl Harbor. And then they were going to land what they hoped would be non-occupied China. Well, some airplanes, as you know, ditched into that part of China, as well as one actually went into Soviet Russia. But this plane is extremely famous because of the Doolittle Raid and is what put the airplane on the map and really proved its value and capability early on into the war effort for the Americans. Now you can see here on the side where it says Betty's Dream, right next to it says Pop Rice, and they have several bombs. So each bomb would have represented a bombing mission that they would have carried out during the war, as well as 2 ships. The J model really was notorious for becoming a gunship. This airplane, with all of its forward-facing 50 caliber machine guns, would have done several strafing missions in the Pacific theater. Now the B-25 was actually a little bit ahead of its time in the sense that it was one of the first bombers and one of these bigger cargo size airplanes to have a tricycle landing gear system, as opposed to the tail wheels, which you're very familiar with. And you look at a P-51 Mustang or even a T-6, some of the trainers at the time, a lot of airplanes coming out of the 30s had the tail wheel design. So going into the 40s, they decided to go with this tricycle gear because of the stability that provided while you're flying the airplane, as well as the visibility you would get from the pilot by not having a tail wheel on the back. Now you can see here we got 3 massive propellers, and make sure don't stand in the prop arc, but attached to the radial engine, 1 on each side of the wing, and very close in fact to the pilot and the co-pilot in the cockpit. One of the downsides of the B-25 that it was known for, unfortunately, and going into post-war times, was that it caused a tremendous amount of hearing loss, not just for the pilot and the co-pilots, but also for the air crewmen in the back of the airplane. Because as you can see, there is not any more than 1.5 feet, 2 feet of difference between the prop arc and the cockpit, and also the radio engines with the exhaust coming out were extremely loud, throw in the fact that they're all firing 50 caliber machine guns and dropping bombs, and this thing is basically a tin can, so anytime that they were to get shot at or just the noise from the engines would come in, it would ultimately cause a lot of hearing damage, which wasn't good. Something else while I'm on the side of the airplane that's really worth pointing out, right here is a huge steel plate below the pilot's what would have been his torso. And you can see this piece of wood trim with a little bit of paint coming off, which is actually kind of cool for this video. So this wood trim was put in just as a little bit of an airflow enhancement for the airflow coming this way to go from the airplane aluminum material into the steel plate. So this is a solid steel plate. Goes without saying, but the obvious one is so that this is to protect the pilot and the co-pilot from strafing runs from other fighters that were trying to take them out of the skies. So most of the airplane is covered in aluminum, whereas this is solid steel. Now, a lot of B-25s up until this point, up until the J model was developed, actually had a glass nose and maybe 1 machine gun in the front. In fact, the B-25Bs that took off from the USS Hornet for the Doolittle Raid did not have anything close to resembling this with all the machine guns and a metal structure. So this would have been a glass dome for the bombardier to sit in and look down through the Norden bomb sight, and also 1 machine gun to defend himself from enemy fighters. Okay, moving down the fuselage here, we get to the bomb bay doors. Also, this is the ladder of one of the 2 ladders actually on this airplane to go up into, this would have been the cockpit, and farther back is towards the rear gunner station. But these are the bomb bay doors, which are able to carry up to about 3,000 pounds of bombs. With the B-25, it was developed as that medium-sized bomber role, but the pilots in the Pacific actually developed and got really good at a strategy called skip bombing. Literally, when you think of skipping a rock across the water, the B-25 pilots in the Pacific theater, especially in the South Pacific, got really good at flying very low, dropping the bombs in the water, and having the bombs skip across the water to go and actually hit the enemy ships. So this was a very common practice that was used during the war. In fact, it was invented by a major, his name was Major Pappy Gunn, that was his call sign, Pappy, who kind of came up with the concept. So pilots really perfected this art of skip bombing, and actually proved to be extremely effective, especially with 10 to 18 forward-mounted 50 caliber machine guns. So they would literally fly low towards these Japanese shipping vessels, strafe them, which also suppressed the anti-aircraft fire coming their way. And then as soon as they got close enough, they would drop their payload of bombs. They'd skip across the water, slam to the side of the boat or the ship, break a hole, and they had a 5-second fuse delay, and then the bombs would explode. It was actually really successful in sinking a lot of Japanese ships in World War II. Pretty cool. Hey, real quick, if you're selling your airplane or helicopter and think a video like this would help any, I've got 5 spots open. I'll come to you, film a full review just like this one, to then publish that video onto this channel to help you get your aircraft sold. If you're interested, just hit the link in the description. All right, let's get back to the video. I just want to take a moment to really showcase how big some components of this airplane are. I'm 6 feet tall, and with my hands fully extended, I still can't even touch anywhere near close to the top of the propeller. Also moving back this way, look at how big these tires are. It's every bit of 3.5 feet coming up to my waistline right here. It's just pretty amazing when you think of the time period and how that long before the computer was ever developed and using slide rules, they invented this and many airplanes just like this in different configurations. With the limited resources and technology that they had, they created something so magnificent as well as beautiful to look at and fly through the skies. Here's another really cool angle of the Gull Wing design I was talking about. So you can see, starting with the fuselage here, it definitely comes up and out. goes a little bit past where the power plant is up to this point and then goes flat across the wing. You can see up at the top of the B-25, there's actually a gunner position there as well. So on this particular J model, we've got one position there, one on each side of the fuselage, so two more back here, as well as a rear tail gunner in the back. Some earlier B-25 models would have had a ball turret at the bottom here and smaller bomb bay doors. But being as this is a J model, they actually got rid of the gunner position in the nose that we talked about, put in many 50 caliber machine guns up there, increase the bomb bay door length, and also remove the bottom turret gunner that would have been in the beginning of some earlier B-25 models. Here we are at the back of the airplane. You can see the twin 50 caliber machine guns coming out from the tail gunner. His head would have been popped up out of there. I sat in that seat. We're going to do it here in a little bit. It's extremely tight. But also really what's interesting and worth pointing out is the lack of metal around this part. It's just my best guess that this is for full flexibility for the machine gun. Also, they are belt fed from 50 caliber ammo boxes that are all the way about here. So these boxes are in the back on the inside of the airplane, and the ammo is run out to the 50 calibers. Remember, these airplanes, especially in Europe, were known to be extremely cold. In the Pacific, guys were wearing t-shirts, and there's a little bit more of that because of just how hot and humid it was. But over Nazi Germany at the time, extremely cold weather. That's why you get the bomber jackets that we're so familiar with seeing in all the movies, mainly because this is aviation aluminum, and it's basically a tin can. And then you get to something like this in the back that doesn't even have any metal covering. It's just got this material for the 50 caliber to be able to maneuver appropriately. So something else worth pointing out about the B-25 is all the flight control surfaces are actually wrapped and covered in fabric. So the flap right here above me is solid metal, but the ailerons right here are wrapped in fabric. Same is true for the back of the airplane here. As we go over to the tail section, you can see here very clearly once you get close to it, that is wrapped in fabric, as well as the elevators here in the back. I just reviewed a P-51 Mustang on this channel, and it was the same thing. So I find that really interesting that as the Allies and just, I guess, manufacturing in general was progressing with airplane development, going more into the all-metal airframe, they still decided to keep on fabric on certain parts of the wing. If I had to guess, it was probably for a couple different reasons. The first one is that it would be light. So it would have been extremely light, and to save on weight, because every airplane, especially these bombers and fighters, taking it from small runways, carrying huge payloads of bombs and fuel to get there, every pound matters. Also, when you wrap something in fabric, just like most experimental bush planes, let's say today, the flight controls are still very responsive. But the pilots loved it, it saved on weight, and you really can't tell from looking at the outside of the airplane because it matches the metal frame just the same. Now you might think that this B-25 looks really nice, but at the end of the day, it's just a museum piece because there's an American flag behind it, other planes parked here. And that's where you'd be wrong. This airplane was actually airworthy until very recently when the engines went kaput. However, the museum here has extra backup brand new engines. I'll show you what I mean. Right over here is one of their two brand new engines from the factory. When I say brand new, I don't mean 2020 something. I mean 1940s brand new. This has literally been in a crate for the last 80 years at the factory. In fact, it's my understanding they have dozens, if not hundreds of these backup engines ready to go. But this is a brand new 1940s engine that is about to be put back into the B-25. One on the port side, one on the starboard side. And once that is done, the American Honor Foundation, where I'm at, is actually gonna be flying this Betty's Dream once again. Sometimes I gotta pinch myself with the freedom that I'm given as a YouTuber to walk around these multi-million-dollar warbirds as well as some business jets, almost completely unsupervised. And in fact, because I've got that opportunity, I'm gonna take you along for a little journey up inside the belly of the B-25. Here we are by the bomb bay doors. These are obviously dummy bombs, at least so I hope. We've got 5 on each side. Now this could have carried just about 3,000 pounds of a payload back in World War II. There's also a ditching hatch right here that would have been used if needed. But we're gonna go up inside the cockpit. I'm gonna climb up. There's a nice big handhold. But I'll tell you, even though you can't see me, it is tight. Woo! Okay. Now I'm sitting what would have been the co-pilot seat on the right side of the cockpit here in the B-25. It's pretty sweet. Now mind you, this cockpit was designed for much younger and smaller men than myself. They're designed for 18 to 22-year-olds in the early 1940s that would have been anywhere from 5 feet 8 inches-ish in height and about 150-ish pounds, not the 6 feet, 200-plus pound people we have today. That's a P-51 Mustang starting up in the hangar next door. Now I'm sitting in the pilot seat of the B-25 here, and as you can tell, there's not a lot of room. This is actually a neat concept and design though. This is a solid steel structure behind the pilot seat. We mentioned how there was a steel frame to the left and to the right of the cockpit, right below where the pilot's torsos and legs would be. But this closes, and we're missing a little bit of a seat cushion here, but you can still tell that's where I would sit. Normally if I was gonna fly this airplane, and not a lot of wiggle room to maneuver about the cockpit. I mean, this thing even really kind of juts out into my side here. Right here is actually how you close the window on the side of the airplane. You just squeeze that. This had no air conditioning, so airflow would be your best bet for getting some movement of air in the cockpit. There's also a neat sunshade system that I don't want to pull too much because it's 80 years old, but it would have covered the sun. And if you've never flown in airplanes with a glass cockpit like this up top, the sun can be very bothersome, especially for a long period of time. Just the sunlight coming in, it really wears on you. So having a sunshade is a nice touch for sure. Moving left to right in the cockpit here, to the left of my thigh, we've got the right and left engine fuel shutoff valves, as well as this is the bomb control unit. So here we have a bomb salvo valve, which you would actually release to drop the bombs. It looks something like turn the switch on to power this unit, open the bomb bay doors, arm the bombs, and you as the pilot actually had the ability to drop the bombs. Also, the bombardier could drop the bombs if need be. Looking at the avionics here, we do have some modern amenities with the radios and such, but there are pretty basic static instruments where the 6-pack would be, as well as the engine monitoring instrumentation. Looking at the yoke here, we've got the very obvious red gun button, as well as the release button for the bombs of the tanks. Right above the pilot here, we've got a pretty simple gun sight with the crosshairs for literally shooting your target, and as well as the same, what would be a heads-up display-ish, and it's the same one found in the P-51 Mustang. So I'm no gun expert or red dot expert, but I do believe that this technology from World War II is actually the same and was the precursor for red and green dots as we know them today on rifles and pistols. Moving towards the middle of the cockpit here, we have our power levers for controlling the engine, as well as our elevator trim, and also right below here we've got the supercharger controls to power the 2 superchargers, one on each engine. Down here we've got our flap and landing gear controls. This is for opening and closing the cowling on the flaps, and this is for the actual wing flaps right here, as well as the landing gear up and down handle. Moving back below that, we have the rudder trim as well as the aileron trim. So it was nice you could trim all 3 axes in the airplane. And looking at the co-pilot side of the cockpit here, I'm not going to begin to try and pretend that I am a bombardier or bombing expert by any means, but this has something to do with the bombs and the timing and setting the intervals of when you're dropping the bombs out of the bomb bay doors. Back on the right side of the cockpit by the co-pilot side, and as well as the pilot definitely has one as well, and also all throughout the airplane in different seating areas, is this heated clothing setup. So this is for heating your flight gear, because you could plug your flight gear into this to give you a little bit of warmth. But if I had to guess, as a former Navy pilot myself, and like most things in the military, this probably worked okay half the time and not at all for the rest of the time. Now to get out of the cockpit, I got to release this lever to put half my seat back to where it goes, and I'm going to get out, and you can see the hatch that I climbed up in to get into the cockpit. Okay, so here's the seat. I'm right above the hatch, right behind the pilot and the co-pilot seat. They would have had to basically put their feet down on these footrests, get up there as much as possible, and then the pilot, the co-pilot, to the best of my understanding, is they would literally come up here and close this seat. Now, from this position, that is where the gunner would have sat with their butt on the seat, looking up into the gun turret and out. All right, now I'm a one-man show here, doing the best I can, but this is what it looks like of me, almost kind of sort of up all the way into the forward turret. I'll bring the camera up over top of myself if I can. And this is the view. You can see it's really tight up here. Now, coming out of the cockpit here, there are 2 ways when the airplane's on the ground to get into the rear of the airplane. One is obviously climbing down the steps here, being on the ground, coming in the back of the airplane here, watching my head, mind you, and going up the second set of steps here into this aft area. And the other way to get back here, which only would have been possible for flying in the air, is to climb in over a very small opening that goes from the cockpit back to this rear gunner station. So I'm going to go and attempt to do that right now. Okay, so I'm just aft of the cockpit now, next to the gunner station for this turret up top, coming in here. Now, I'm no 18-year-old spring chicken, but I'm also not wearing any flight gear. And you can see this is extremely tight. Go out to the coast, we'll get together, have a few laughs. The things you do for the algorithm. Okay, just crawled through this crawl space right here. coming into the area where the radio operator, at least that's what I believe that would have sat. Now I'm in the waist gunner section of the B-25 where there are two 50 caliber machine guns and two pretty tiny windows to look out from to shoot down enemy fighters that are trying to shoot you down. Pull the 50 caliber out. That's what it would look like. And let me tell you, as an American man, this is a pretty awesome feeling. You can see here we've got some pulleys that are holding the weight of the 50 caliber up, as well as the 50 caliber bullets that are belt fed from ammo box that's right here. You pull this guy back, put it around the chamber. Here's your trigger. You're ready to rock and roll. Trying to imagine a Luftwaffe Messerschmitt coming my way, strafing from the side. That would be a pretty scary day. And to think these boys did it day in and day out for a couple of years at a time, it's pretty remarkable. Okay, moving even further aft over the escape hatch right here. Going back into the tail gunner position. I don't know if you can tell from the video, but it gets extremely tight. Okay, now I'm sitting up fully in the tail gunner position seat. It's getting a little hot up in here. You can see I'm already fogging up the canopy above me. But it's really tight. You really can't tell from this angle, but there are 50 caliber bullets that have a little bit of protection from the chain that would otherwise be rubbing on my arms, but there's not a lot of wiggle room in my knees. I'm kind of in a half sitting down, half squatting position. My butt is being supported by a seat, but then my knees are forward and actually resting on some cushions. So I grab it right here, and then I believe, have the ability to aim my 50 caliber machine guns up and down because my yoke is moving as we speak. So that's why the end of the tail here on the B-25 doesn't have a metal frame around it like the rest of the airplane is. It has that almost like a tarp type material, which I'm sure is a little bit of an insulation, or it has insulating properties to keep the cold out and the heat in, but it allows for that movement of the 250 caliber machine guns as I move it around and shoot down my enemies. I do get a decent amount of visibility here, but I gotta imagine this is a really exposed position, because if you're coming up from behind a B-25, if you're in an enemy fighter, the first thing you do is aim for that gunner so that they don't aim at you. Coming out of the tail gunner section into where the aft gunners would be, and right by the ditching hatch / entrance would have been some hand-thrown grenades or bombs that would have been dropped out of the hatch here. We also have our life-saving survival equipment in this area. Really cool. Just feels like I'm stepping back in time 80 years into a time capsule of American might and muscle. And now it's time to give this North American B-25J Mitchell a flyby score. Originally built for war, but now a living piece of flying history, the B-25 Mitchell is one of the most iconic aircraft of World War II. With its rumbling radial engines, bomber cockpit layout, and an unmistakable twin tail, the B-25 turns every takeoff into an air show and every ramp into a museum. Flying it is quite literally a full-body experience. It's loud, physical, and demanding, but deeply rewarding for skilled aviators. Handling isn't light or nimble, but it's surprisingly stable and docile for a medium bomber. Range is respectable for long cross countries, and the view from the cockpit is unforgettable. Of course, owning one is no small feat. Operating costs are sky high, insurance is specialized, and you'll need a few full-time mechanics to keep it flying. But in terms of mission, ownership pride, and sheer cool factor, few aircraft on Earth can compete. This is not a plane you buy with your head, it's one you buy with your heart. And because, well, America. All right, let's get out of here. Well, that about wraps up my review of the incredible B-25J Mitchell bomber, such an iconic aircraft of World War II that served not only in the European theater, but also in the Pacific as well. It's highly likely that without this airplane and the brave men that flew them into combat, we would not have won the war and enjoy the freedoms we do today. I just want to give a huge thank you and shout out to the American Honor Foundation here in Ocala, Florida, for giving me access to the Mitchell, as well as some of the other airplanes they have around the museum, and those videos are coming out soon, by the way. Also, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to check out the P-51 Mustang video I just published to the channel. Link is in the description. Until next time, I'm Rob Roy from FlyBuyer.com, and I'm out of here. See ya!